here for Maple Syrup Festival.
Okay, thank you. I just need that number at the bottom.
92531.
92531?
Yeah.
You're just gonna head over to parking lot number 1.
Number 1, okay.
Turn right at the sign, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a information booth at the end of the parking lot. Just give them that number again.
Okay.
Get your wristband, and then you'll be engaged.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any map or something like that?
There's a map by the parking lot.
Okay, thank you.
Did you order coffee today?
I didn't book it upfront, but
That's the maple syrup in the park. This is the first station. This is the Sweetwater station. So just to let you guys know, this station is all about Indigenous teachings of how Indigenous people from Canada used to make maple syrup from maple sap. So I just came with Musgrave Plus taught. Indigenous people used turtle shells as their calendar system back in the day. So each scale on this turtle shell would represent a different season. So for instance, one scale would represent the strawberry moon, and that would indicate when strawberries were in season, so that would be closer to the springtime. And then another scale would represent the maple moon, so that would indicate when maple syrup was in season. So when it was the maple moon, that's when the Indigenous men knew that they needed to go out to harvest the maple sap from the sugar maple trees. So I'm going to test your knowledge really quickly. I have two beautiful trees beside me. I have this guy over here, quite large, and I have this beautiful tree over here. Does anybody know which tree is a sugar maple tree? Dark gray ash bark, as you can see here. I also have my stump over here that's also a sugar maple tree. So these trees typically grew right next to the hemlock trees, and that was really convenient and beneficial for the Indigenous men, because in hemlock trees, you could a few different tools. Here I have an antler of an animal that they would have used. Can anyone tell me if they know what animal this antler might be from? We might see it sometimes in our park. Yes, yeah, I heard a deer. So this is a deer antler. So they would have used this to create the little indent that you see in my sugar maple tree. And also, they would use a rock as a hammer. So what they would do is they would insert the deer horn here, the antler here, into the tree. They would insert 4.5 inches deep into the tree. And this actually wouldn't hurt the tree at all. The tree would be able to recover from this, so it was a very sustainable method. So they would insert it, use the rock as a hammer as so, until you're 4.5 inches deep. From there, they would get a wooden spile, and the spile made it really easy for the sap to run down through. So they would insert the spile directly in, and then from there, they would use this little basket. Does anybody know what material this basket is made of? Birch, yes. So this is a birch bark basket. So it would collect all the sap for the Indigenous peoples. It was water resistant and really durable. So they would insert the spile, and all the sap would pour directly into their birch baskets. They would actually have to tap over 100 trees in order to get enough sap for what they needed. So what they would do next, they would have all the sap in their baskets. They would head over here to their clay pots. So their clay pots, this is actually a more accurate depiction of what their clay pots would have looked like. This is my demo pot here. So this is a clay pot that they would have used. As you can see, it's a lot larger than this one. But they would pour all the sap into a clay pot like this. At the bottom of the clay pot, they would put hot rocks and hot coals because they needed to evaporate all the water from the sap. As you guys know, maple sap is 97% water and only 3% sugar. So they need to try to evaporate as much water as possible to just be left with this sugar sap. So what they would do is they'd have all the hot rocks, they would take some birch bark, put it over to try to evaporate as much water as possible. They would let it sit. And then what they also did overnight is they would take the sap, pour it into, you can see my little wooden crevices here, and they would let it sit overnight. In the cold winters, the sap in the morning, they would wake up, it would be completely frozen. The top part would be frozen, they'd chip away at the ice, and then they'd be left with just the sap that they needed. And what they would do after that is they would take some type of maneuvering, they would stir it all up to create a granulated texture. They'd be stirring and stirring, stirring, and then you would be left with is maple sugar. So the entire process of them collecting, this was their final result. This is what they wanted. They didn't really care for the maple syrup because it was harder for them to transport. They wanted the maple sugar. It's easier for them to transport. They put them in wooden cones like this one. This is also made out of birch bark. The sugar would actually attach directly to the birch bark. You wouldn't have to worry about it dripping. They would actually hang them like this as well, so when it would rain or snow, nothing would get into the maple sugar, so they're completely protected. And sometimes they would eat it, but mainly they used it for trading. So that was the main purpose of them going out to collect all that sap, was for trading purposes. So they could trade a maple sugar cone for an entire pelt. So they might trade this cone for a European settler. European settler might give them one of these pelts. Does anybody know what animal this is? Anyone want to take a guess?
Beaver?
It's a beaver.
Beaver,
Yes, this
yeah.
is a beaver pelt. It's a big beaver pelt. So that would be a great trade after all that hard work of creating this maple sugar cone. You can trade it for a beaver pelt. So indigenous peoples didn't really eat the maple sugar, but Europeans typically used it for tea and things like that. Indigenous peoples mainly just wanted the furs. So at the end of the day, they would come back with this. They would come home and they get to be nice and warm for the winter season. So those are the teachings that I have to share with you today.
Drive into the tree, okay? And then with the other hand, you're kind of gonna turn it and spin it. And as you're doing this motion, you're actually drilling a hole about 1.5 to 2 inches deep into the tree's bark. So pretend this is like a really big sugar maple. The way to look like, essentially, you're pressing up against it like this, and then you're just turning and turning and turning and turning until you're out of breath. No, I'm kidding. Until you're about 2 inches deep, right? So that was predominantly the job of the fathers and the grandfathers. And once they tapped about 2 to 3 holes in these trees, they'd use the metal spile, right? So you might have learned that they use cedar wood or sumac spiles in the past. So these are actually a bit more durable because they don't break as easily. And there's actually a little flat spot there that you could actually hammer the spile more directly into the tree, so that it's not as loose. The sap can flawlessly kind of just seep into the bucket that you can hang under the spile. So a lot more efficient. And yeah, that's more or less the job of the fathers. Now you might be wondering, whose job was it to collect the sap buckets once they were full? Any guesses? The kids, yeah, great guess. The kids were actually responsible for essentially bringing these yokes and attaching the sap buckets on each side, and they'd have to carry it from the woods all the way to where the fire station was. Now, some kids might have been lucky and they would have been pretty close. Others, it might have been quite a walk, right? So one can imagine. This is already heavy as it is, so with two buckets full of sap, that's some tough labor, tough love, right? Now, a fun fact that maybe some of you knew, maybe some of you don't, but this actually began the origin of what we call March break. So nowadays, children, and you probably love March break, right? It's like a little break, vacation from school. I know I enjoyed it, but no, actually, March break was not for kids to go home and rest, but it was actually to go home and work. So they were the ones that were helping out their family during this time of collecting maple sap, right? So once the kids, they brought the yoke and they brought it to the fire station. This is actually the final step in maple syrup production, and they empty out the sap buckets into this really large kettle pot here, right? So this next job was predominantly done by the women. So the mothers, the grandmothers would help out with this, and their job was to tend to the fire, but to also ensure that the maple sap was burning into the maple syrup. So if I show everyone this, what does this look like? It looks like water, right? And that's because when you first collect maple sap, 97% of it's water. So this larger pot is used to boil down as much water as we can, essentially, in a couple of hours. so that we can then transfer it to the next pot. So I'm just gonna loop around. And then, let's take a look. So it's a bit darker in color, right? And so the concept here is that as we go down, we're trying to get more concentrated sap until we get to the final kettle pot, which you'll notice it's a lot darker, right? And that's probably a color that's a lot closer to what we see whenever we have our pancakes with pizza syrup and stuff, right? So the grandmother's
through the sugar, it's going to tell me exactly how much sugar is in my syrup. So we want to get it to around 55% or so before we filter it off here and take it over to the propane finishing pan. The reason that we need it to be exactly 66% is if there's too much water in your syrup, it can go moldy. And if there's too much, if you boil it past that point, that's when you start making maple taffy, or boil it right down and you get a granular sugar. Now every year, we've got about 6 to 8 weeks to collect sap and make syrup. What we need is really cold temperatures at night and really warm temperatures during the day. So -5 at night, +5 during the day, that's the ideal temperature range to collect sap and make syrup. Within that 6 to 8 weeks, we're gonna produce 4 different colors of syrup. So this is our grading kit here. This container is empty so we can measure our own syrup. But here, we're going to start the season off making a golden syrup. It's very light, very delicate flavor. And as the season goes on, it gets progressively darker. So we've got an amber syrup that has a rich flavor, a dark syrup that has a robust flavor, and finally at the end of the season, you're going to produce a really dark, strong flavored maple syrup. They all have the same amount of sugar, that's 66%. What's changing over the course of the season is the color and the flavor. And it's all personal preference, it all just depends what you prefer. What you're gonna have at the Pancake House today is amber syrup. I really like the very dark, strong maple syrup. I like to put it in my coffee every morning, but that's just me, it's personal preference.